Welcome to WSJ.com. I am Paul Vigna. I'm joined today by Gary Johnson, who's a two-term Republican governor of New Mexico, ran for president, ran for the GOP nomination last year, now running as the Libertarian candidate. And Governor Johnson, I want to thank you for coming in today.
Great to be with you. And, I'm kind of excited about running for the Libertarian nomination. I think that Ron Paul and I were, for the most part, delivering the same message. He and I do have differences, but I don't think he's going to be successful getting the Republican nomination, and at that point, nobody carries this message forward. And I have to tell you, from a communication standpoint, when people hear the same thing from different people, it begins to resonate a little bit more. And it needs to be from more than just two, meaning more than just myself and Ron Paul. But I think we represent a whole lot of people that are recognizing the problems that this country is facing, offering up the solutions. And in my case, I'm making the case that I actually have the resume to suggest that I'll doggedly pursue going after it.
Well, so that brings up a question. You're running as a Libertarian. You ran for the Republican nomination, didn't get it, dropped out of the Republican Party, running as a Libertarian. Why should people vote for somebody who is not a Democrat or a Republican? Why should people choose a third party?
Well, answering it a little bit differently, when Ross Perot ran as a third-party candidate against Clinton and Bush, 40% of Americans said they would consider voting for a third-party candidate. He ended up getting 20% of the vote. Right now, Paul, 70% of Americans are saying that they would consider voting for a third-party candidate. That's unprecedented. And third-party candidacy aside, I really think that libertarians perhaps take the best from both parties. The fiscal side of the Republicans and the social side Democrats. The brain from the Republican, the heart from the Democrat.
So why... Okay, you're not a career politician, we should point that out either. You started out in construction, built your own business, ran in the 90s for New Mexico governor, won 2 terms, term limits, you're out. You're not a career politician, but you were a Republican. What about these two? You're more intimate with the Republican Party, but what about both of these parties disillusioned you so much that you left the Republican Party and you went to the Libertarians? Because they had tried in the past to draft you, I know this, and you've resisted that. And even in 2010, you were interviewed by the Wallstreet Journal, and you said, I am a Republican. What do you see that has changed? What changed your mind that got you to leave the Republican Party and become a Libertarian?
Well, if you look at Occupy Wall Street, I share in their outrage that this country's up for sale. It's not fair. And both parties have their hands out. And that's, I guess, what I've seen now at a really heightened level. Paul, I was excluded from debates where I had to have a certain showing in A, B, and C polls, like 2%, to be in the debates. I wasn't in A, B, and C poll. I wasn't an option to be able to choose. I thought that I was unquestionably, unfairly taken out of those debates. I was able to appear in 2 out of the 19. I think the message is really important. I've always been a messenger here, and it's about an agenda. And no, I'm not a career politician. I've run for 2 offices in my life, governor of New Mexico, re-election as governor of New Mexico, and I've never been involved in government before I became governor or after.
So why do you think you were excluded from those debates? I mean, I know that the math of it, you weren't in those polls, but I mean, is it your message? Is it because you're so far off of the sort of typical Republican message that we see from some of the other candidates?
So CNN 5 months ago included me in their biweekly poll, which is a poll they do every couple of weeks. And I was at 2% of the vote, which at that time tied me with Kane, put me ahead of Santorum, and put me ahead of Huntsman. After I appeared at 2% in that poll, which, by the way, they use as a basis for who gets in the debates, that was the last time my name appeared in any of their polls. I was excluded from their polls from that point on. They gave no explanation whatsoever.
All right, so let's get off the polling for a second because we could talk about it all day. I mean, I want to get back to something you said. It was interesting about both these parties having their hands out. A lot of people, what I hear a lot of people say they say Washington's dysfunctional. They can't get anything done. They're not, nobody knows what to do down there. But I wonder, is it really a fact that that D.C. is dysfunctional, or is it a matter of there is so much money being handed out down there? Both parties are taking a lot of money. It creates more competitive races. You see this very even split. And I think part of it is because of how much money is being spent down there. Then you add in gerrymandering. My question is, do you think that Washington actually, rather than being dysfunctional, is working the way certain people want it to work, which I would say is not for the benefit of the American people?
I thought you articulated that very well, and I would agree with the latter, that it is up for sale, and that really it's not so much dysfunction as just an absolute wrong direction. The Republicans rail on President Obama's health care plan because it's unaffordable, and yet just a few short years before that, Republicans control both houses of Congress and the presidency, and at that time they passed the largest entitlement program in the history of this country, which was prescription health care benefit for
President
seniors.
Bush's plan.
Exactly.
Right.
So when the Republicans did that, wow, that was to me a disconnect. That was not why I signed up to be a Republican. For as good as Ronald Reagan was for the country, I did not vote for Ronald Reagan the second time. I voted for the Libertarian candidate because of the deficits that he ran up. I just thought that, again, on one side, cut taxes, but and I realize he battled it out when it came to spending, but the reality was the largest deficit increase we'd ever had at that time.
Right. And look, I don't think the United States government, has had a balanced budget in pretty sure it's at least 40 years.
Well, of course, we had a balanced budget with Clinton, I believe, 1 year, but I think that was an aberration. And I speak aberration. It was luck. It was just luck. One of the things I'm promising to do as President of the United States is to submit a balanced budget to Congress in the year 2013. I'm also promising to veto legislation where expenses exceed revenue. Now, that's not promising a balanced budget. That's promising to submit a balanced budget. That's promising to veto legislation, expenses exceed revenue. I offer up that spending would be lower in the scenario that I just pointed out than any other possible scenario that you would come up with. I would have been elected. It would be the electorate in this country shouting at Washington, "We want a balanced budget." And they're going to have to cut spending beyond what they ever dreamed of to stay in office.
To have a balanced budget, you'd be talking about cutting $1 trillion.
$1.4 trillion, 43 cents out of the dollar that we're currently spending.
Where do you find that? That's a lot of cut. Where do you find that? Well,
I like to start off by talking about Medicaid, Medicare, and military spending. So when it comes to Medicaid, I oversaw the reform of Medicaid in the state of New Mexico. We went from a fee-for-service model to a managed care model. We delivered better health care networks, and we saved hundreds of millions of dollars. At that time, I believe if the federal government would have block granted the state of New Mexico 43% less money, done away with all the strings and all the mandates on how that on health care delivery to the poor, that I could have accomplished that with 43% less money. Medicaid, I'm offering up the same solution, that I could have overseen the delivery of health care to those over 65 with 43% less money if all the strings and all the mandates associated with delivery of health care to those over 65 would have been eliminated. Medicare is a fee-for-service model right now nationwide. So giving Medicaid and Medicare back to the states, 50 laboratories of best practice, I think that's exactly what you'll have. You'll also have some failure that will get avoided, but one size fits all. That's what has us in the predicament that we're in right now.
You think it's mainly the bureaucracy surrounding these government health care programs that creates all the extra costs? Well, that is driving us into deficits?
It is. So we talk about the safety net. I really do believe there are those in need, and that in our prosperity we can take care of those that are truly in need. I just think we've gone way over the line with regard to those truly in need, and that we can tighten that up significantly. people kind of fall off their chair when you start talking about a 43% reduction in Medicare. But the alternative is no Medicare at all. The alternative is a system that collapses on itself because, monetarily speaking, we inflate the dollar out of being able to buy anything.
Yeah, let's talk about defense. You mentioned defense also. I mean, obviously after World War II, the United States stood as the lone superpower, the Colossus. We had the Soviet Union. The United States was the bulwark against that. That is kind of when we became the watchdog of the world. That situation led to us having a lot of overseas bases in Europe and Asia. You want to start scuttling all that. You want to cut that back.
Well, so
it's actually a big platform of yours.
Well, so here's how a 43% reduction works when it comes to military. And I'm not operating in a vacuum here. I've had a lot of really smart people sit down with me, and we've talked about it at length. But the premise is, and everyone that I'm dealing with is in agreement, we can provide a strong national defense for ourselves and still cut military spending by 43%. The operative word being defense as opposed to offense, as opposed to nation building. When you talk about a 43% reduction in military spending, we're only going back to the year 2003. And when you talk about a 43% reduction in military spending, it's reducing nuclear warheads from 2,300 to 500. Paul, we've grown up our entire lives. How many times do we need to blow up the planet? 10 times, or might 5.7 do it? Well, 5.7, I think, might do it. It is all those military bases. The notion that we can cut those by 43%. It's those. It's the military personnel in uniform. It's the civilian support staff that goes along with that. It's the conflicts that we're currently engaged in. It's research and development. It's intelligence. I'm opposed to foreign aid. I think it's crazy that we should be printing money and borrowing money to the tune of 43 cents out of every dollar and then giving it away. But I think it's important to distinguish between foreign aid and military alliances. Military alliances being key to shifting the burden to other countries. Of the dollar that's being spent worldwide on military spending, about half of that is being spent by the United States. You take the next 17 countries combined, and we outspend them. So it's a little lopsided.
But still, if you did that, obviously you couldn't do it overnight. But even if you did that, you're talking about, you talked about the civilian support staff, you talked about research and development. You're talking about, actually it ends up being a pretty significant chunk of our economy, and it's a pretty big piece of geopolitical, to what extent we have geopolitical peace in the world. The United States helps provide a lot of that. How would you deal with the fallout to those two?
Well, the other thing, making two promises, promising to balance the federal budget, veto expenses that exceed revenue, and then to advocate on the part of throwing out the entire federal tax system and replacing it with the fair tax, which you're probably pretty well versed in. Mm-hmm. But the 23% consumption tax that by all analysis should end up to be cost neutral over a very short amount of time. So it makes American goods and services competitive for export. That's really the answer when it comes to rebooting the American economy. Zero corporate taxes, zero income taxes, no more IRS, no more withholdings from your payroll check. If in a zero corporate tax rate environment, the private sector doesn't create tens of millions of jobs in this country, I don't know under what scenario that happens. Why would you grow, nurture, start up a business anywhere in the world if given a choice other than here, given that kind of a tax rate?
Since you started talking about jobs, let's talk about that. That was one of the things I wanted to bring up. I don't think it's going too far to say that over the last generation or so in this country, we've lost most of the manufacturing base. A lot of jobs have been shipped overseas. You've seen wages for most people in this country have stagnated. You now have the two-income family is now pretty much standard. I think 35, 40 years ago, that was a rarer thing. What kinds of, do you really think it's as simple as just changing a tax code and you're suddenly going to bring back all these kinds of jobs? My question is, how are you going to create jobs that pay a living wage where people can raise a family?
Well, they did an analysis of all the presidential candidates running for president and which presidential candidate had the best record when it came to jobs. And they went into Romney. And then as kind of a side note, they said, well, and actually the guy with the best record is Gary Johnson from New Mexico. And when asked for my response, which I also said when I was governor of New Mexico, I didn't create a single job while I was governor of New Mexico. But because I controlled all the agencies, because I made appointments to all the boards and commissions, effectively I controlled all rules and regulations. And they got better on a daily basis. And if you want to summarize how they got better, less time and less money that you and I had to spend to comply with those rules and regulations, not making us any safer, not making us any more secure, just adding time and adding money. So what government can do and should do is just create the environment. That's all that it can do. I'm going to argue that the fair tax, I'm going to argue that the fair tax is the environment, and then getting back to leadership and being in the position and making appointments, and then sticking to the notion of rules and regulations from a common sense viewpoint really has a positive effect. It has an unbelievably positive effect.
You mentioned common sense. Why do you think, or do you think maybe, that there seems to be a serious lack of common sense in Washington, D.C.? Why do you think that is? It seems like the kinds of proposals that you're talking about, yeah, anyone can say it. Oh, let's get rid of the income tax. The odds of that happening, even if you're elected president, I mean, the odds of that happening, I think they sound pretty low. Sounds like you would have a big fight on your hands.
Well, and that's okay. Back to leadership. You take on that fight, and you take it on every day. If I have issues with politicians, gosh, didn't you get elected to actually go and do the right thing as opposed to hand out and getting reelected? So why isn't this happening? What's the root of all the problem? The root of all the problem is politicians basically want to get reelected, and they'll do anything to get reelected. And back to the fair tax. I think the fair tax issues the pink slip to half of Washington lobbyists, because half of Washington lobbyists are there to grant you, whether you're a business or an individual or a group, your special place in line, which is the front of the line, if you got the money to pay for it. And that's got to go away. And
part of that, I think, is certainly within the income tax, a lot of these things get embedded. The income tax code, to me, seems like a great place for politicians to hand out favors, to dollop out little something here and there.
So let me make a comment right now. You should be sitting here, and probably would if given the opportunity. So I'd like to think that I'm, based on what you're saying, liking to think that I'm a spokesperson for what a lot of people are thinking, and I'm hearing that from you, the same thing.
Okay, well, let's talk about that. You and I, maybe we're pragmatists. I would like to think we are. But the reality is, you're running as a libertarian. No libertarian candidate has ever polled in a national election. I think if it's not above 1%, it's certainly above 5%. And on top of that, there has not been a president in the White House since 1853 who has not been a Democrat or a Republican. It's great that you're talking. It's great that you're running.
Right.
But the odds against you are obviously, and history is not only suggesting that you won't win, history is screaming it. Why are you running?
Well, I wouldn't be doing it if there wasn't actually the chance to win. And then aside from that, right now I'm polling at 9% against Obama and Romney, believing that Romney is the presumptive nominee. I think you probably stick in any name, and I was saying, tongue-in-cheek, that I think Mickey Mouse might have done 15 in that same poll. But there is a real opportunity here to potentially to poll at 15% and be on the debate stage with Romney and Obama. And who knows?
Is that what you need to do? Do you need to poll at 15%?
15 to be on the debate stage.
debate stage.
And then a 5% showing in in the general election, which you pointed out earlier, and it's true, the best a Libertarian candidate has ever done is just over 1%.
Yeah.
But if a Libertarian candidate gets over 5%, then that candidate gets significant federal matching funds that potentially allows that candidate to move the message even further off election. So if it isn't this cycle, there is the possibility of continuing to be able to talk about this. And I've got the opportunity to talk about it. I've got the opportunity to be a messenger here. I may not be the best messenger, but as long as somebody else better hasn't come along, and for that matter, somebody else better comes along, then they can hear it from many different sources as opposed to just one. When it's just one, Ron Paul's been labeled as kooky, and he's not.
So it's 2012. We are several years removed from Panic of 2008, the crash, the recession, all those things. But all those things are really, in a large sense, still with us. And most people, I think, are still dealing with the fallout from that. You mentioned Occupy Wall Street earlier, the Tea Parties also. There is a lot of anger among the electorate. Do you think 2012 sort of is a historical moment where maybe a third-party candidate who in normal times would not have a chance might have a chance?
Well,
is that part of your thinking?
Well, back to 70% of the population right now saying, 70% of Americans right now saying they would consider voting for a third-party candidate. That number has never remotely been that high.
Yeah. So you do?
Absolutely.
Your answer is yes.
Absolutely.
All
Statistically
right.
borne out.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the economy. We have a $15 trillion economy, according to GDP. We also have $15 trillion in debt. We have wages that really aren't growing. We have millions of people unemployed, more millions who say they would work if they could find a job, but they can't find one. How do you get the economy growing? How do you get people spending money? How do you get things? There's a lot of overhang on the economy. How do you sort of wipe some of that away? I mean, $15 trillion in debt. Even if you put in everything that you want to do, it's not going to disappear overnight.
No, and the object is to stop printing money. Well, we can stop printing money when it comes to our current expenditures, but we still have to deal with the $15 trillion in rollover when it comes to treasuries, and we may be faced with having to print money for that. But back to the fair tax, implementing the fair tax, I think that changes us from a consumption economy to a savings economy. It's going to promote savings in a really big way. It's okay to borrow money. There's an implication there that people are willing to loan. They're going to get paid back. But printing money, that's what has to stop. So just back to fundamentals, balancing the federal budget, enacting tax reform in a really big way, and rules and regulations that I will say from my experience as governor of New Mexico, good government was easy. It wasn't hard. It was easy. But it's just a willingness to do the right thing as opposed to doing whatever it takes to get reelected.
All right. Well, and okay, let's spin this forward a little bit. It's November. You've caught lightning in a bottle. You've caught a historical moment. You are elected president. January, you take the oath of office. You're in Washington, D.C. You are the president of the United States. You are now dealing with a Congress made up of Republicans and Democrats that probably aren't going to be too happy to see you in there, I would imagine. You look at interest rates right now. This is very interesting. I mean, interest rates are so low that basically the Congress is spending free money. I mean, I think that's a big part of why they have no restraint. They're spending free money. The income tax, I don't think they're going to give that up easily. How are you going to get your agenda through a Congress that I think would probably not be too welcoming to you?
Well, this is so similar to my experience as governor of New Mexico. I may have the distinction as governor of New Mexico of having vetoed more bills than the other 49 governors in the country combined.
Yeah, they nicknamed you Governor Veto, right?
I vetoed 750 bills. Only 2 were overturned, and so it made a huge difference. All the things that government wasn't going to do. Now, as I pointed out earlier, Congress can override, and in New Mexico, the state is 2-to-1 Democrat. The legislature was 2-to-1 Democrat. a third of the bills that I vetoed were Republican bills. I was an equal opportunity vetoer, so really no difference at all. But you have to get back also to the fact that if I'm elected in November, that is the American people screaming that they want change in a really big way. Mm-hmm. And if Democrats and Republicans don't want to go along with that change, as long as you have the leadership to hang with it and defend it, and I really found that to be the stimulating part of the job, was understanding the issues, really bringing the people together that knew the issues. I got to understand them perhaps better than anyone, and then I got to make judgment on them based not on politics, but on what was right. I just see the same scenario playing out, and Congress doesn't bend a whole lot. They're going to find themselves without a job, and that's the main reason that they're there. For whatever reason, they don't really want to go there to do anything other than to say that they've been elected as a congressperson or a senator.
Yeah. There's been a lot of articles, the Wall Street Journal wrote a lot of them too, about how there are a lot of closed-door meetings in Washington between the Fed and the big banks, between hedge funds and congressional staffers. A lot of information gets passed around down in Washington. Some people might even suggest that there is a culture of cronyism down there.
There is. I don't think there's any question
some
about it.
Some people, maybe I'm one of them, right?
You're a Fed governor, and for the rest of your life, you get to go have lunch, at the Federal Reserve. You get to go play tennis at their tennis courts, and you don't think information gets passed in those kinds of situations?
Of course it does. The question is, how do you change that culture to have a better government?
Well, I think I'll come back to the. I'll come back to the fair tax and come back to a consumption tax. We can debate the finer points of it all, but when you have no more deductions anymore, doesn't that go away? And then the Federal Reserve, talking about the Federal Reserve, I think the Federal Reserve's gotten caught up in this dual mandate of price stability and full employment, and I think they're contrary to one another, and that the Federal Reserve very basically should be about strong U.S. dollar, not weak U.S. dollar. They should have provided the liquidity that they've provided, but interest rates are at zero, because if they weren't at zero, we would be in the midst of that monetary collapse right now.
It's interesting you talk about the strong dollar, the weak dollar. I remember, I think it was early in President Bush's first term when his then Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill made the gaffe about saying, well, we don't really have a strong dollar policy. And everybody flipped out, and he had to do a Galileo recantation there. Do you think we have a strong dollar policy?
No, absolutely not.
We have a weak dollar policy.
Well, it couldn't be a weaker dollar policy. Right. I mean, we're flooding ourselves with money, and I'm pointing out the obvious. If we did away with the Federal Reserve tomorrow, the Treasury would still print money, as they did before there was a central bank, and other countries that don't have a central bank, they continue to print money. This lies with Congress. This lies with Congress and the President to stop printing money. In this case, balancing the federal budget. And we're not even talking about the $15 trillion in debt here.
No, you got to work that off. You got to earn it off at some point. Long point away.
Long point away. I just, that's all the bad news. The good news. The good news is we can fix this. We can fix this. If you applied all the money that we may end up spending for the bailouts and the
stimulus and
all of it,
if you take social safety net costs, the automatic stabilizers that just kicked in.
If you take all of that and reboot the American economy on a number of fronts, and would have applied that toward getting over the hump, if you will, what position would we be in today? Well, we'd be on the road to recovery, in my opinion.
Yeah. You have made one of your platforms the legalization or the decriminalization, at least, of marijuana. Why choose that as a platform?
Well, I would like you to think that that's indicative of everything it is that I talk about, which is issues first and politics last. And I don't think there's anything more obviously insane than the fact that we're arresting 1.8 million people a year in this country. We now have 2.3 million people behind bars. I think we should legalize marijuana, control it, regulate it, tax it. It's in no category more dangerous than alcohol, no category, and yet this insanity continues. When it comes to drug reform, let's look at the drug problem first as a health issue rather than a criminal justice issue. When you look at the border right now, don't underestimate the problems with drugs and the fact that this is a prohibition phenomenon being played out at the cost of 40,000 lives over the last 4 years. Didn't we go through this when it came to the prohibition of alcohol, where disputes were being played out with machine guns as opposed to in the courts? Let's get these disputes in the courts.
You were governor of New Mexico. I mean, you had to see that firsthand, right?
I
You
did.
share the border.
I did, and so don't. And then, okay, so that's my stance when it comes to marijuana. As a border state, don't build a fence. What a waste of money.
Yeah.
That would be like building a fence around New York, and somehow that's going to keep you in or out of New York? Well, it's not, because there are going to be a whole bunch of entrepreneurs that are going to dig tunnels and going to charge you a very reasonable fee to get in or out of New York if you so choose. Don't build a fence, though. Don't build a fence. And so there's so many issues facing us: Medicaid, Medicare, military spending, immigration. I would like to think I've got a reasoned approach, and I'm not the only one that has a reasoned approach to everything, but that I do, and that if you look at the drug issue, that's indicative of what I did as governor of New Mexico. Issues first, politics last. That's what you should get involved in politics for, is to actually lead.
Yeah, so you're coming around 2012 now. You're the Libertarian. It's interesting. Recently, you've had the Occupy Wall Street movement. You've had the Tea Party. I see your guy over there is a young, rather hip-looking guy. Are you trying to utilize social media at all to get your message out?
Absolutely.
I mean, it seems like that would be a natural thing for you to do in your position. Are you doing that?
Absolutely. Yeah, we're trying to make the most out of the resources that we have. And, Paul, I'd like to think if you did a financial analysis of all the candidates and where they all are, given the amount of money that we've spent relative to everybody else, I think we've gotten the most bang for the buck.
Yeah. There's too much money spent on politics. I mean, President Obama, I looked this up, he's already raised $125 million. I mean, he's the president. He obviously has the name recognition. He's got $125 million sitting for this re-election campaign. You've raised about $500,000. But I mean, it's obvious that there's a lot of money flowing to these major parties. Does it corrupt the process?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. Well, it works both ways. Newt Gingrich, $3.6 million in consulting fees in the last 3 years. Would he have gotten $3.6 million in consulting fees if he hadn't been the Speaker of the House? And wasn't that kind of a payola? And I say payola.
I thought he was a historian, right?
Well, exactly.
That was what he claimed. So, yeah.
I mean, it is humorous. It's not humorous. It's just telling of a system that's up for sale, and you just look everywhere, and everybody's selling it. President Obama, he goes to any company in this country and asks for a contribution, and they're going to give it. They would be foolish not to, because of the retribution that might follow. Is
that something you can legislate against, or does it really just have to sort of be a voter revolt where the people vote and they say, we're not going to do these candidates, we're not going to vote for these candidates anymore because we hate the system?
I think that it's when it comes to a system change, I just think that money needs to be 100% transparent. That you can't give $1 million to the Republican National Committee, have the Republican National Committee turn around and give it to the candidate of the donator's choice in the first place. Just make that connection from the first place. I also think that if politicians were required to wear jackets similar to NASCAR drivers with the patches commensurate with the size of the contribution,
their sponsors, their corporate donors,
I think that would go a long way too. I really do.
That probably would. All right, we have to leave it there. Governor Johnson, thank you for coming in.
Paul, thank you very much. Thank you.